Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to the A segment of episode 33 of Codename Kids Next Door, Operation Pink-Eye. We begin this segment with number 2 in an office. Number 2 is wearing private eye themed accessories along with his usual outfit. And we also hear him narrating in a style that's similar to the sort of narrations you would hear in film noir. And we hear these type of narrations throughout the course of this segment. In this opening scene, number 2 is talking about how he's realized that the world can have some rather gross moments in it. And he's holding a plate of apple crumbles and he's about to throw them out. Suddenly, we start to have a flashback showing us events from earlier in the day, the morning of earlier that day to be more specific. And in this flashback, we see number 2 in this office while eating the apple crumbles. The narration reveals that Nurse Claiborne was the individual who made these apple crumbles. Soon enough, number 86 enters the office, which she reveals is actually the janitor's closet, and she comments how number 2 is supposed to be in math class right now. Number 2 comments about how he's beginning to do some private eye work, and he also comments about how some kids have not been making it back to class after they've entered the hallway, or some sort of, there's a mystery where some kids have entered the hallway and they haven't made it back to class for whatever reason. Number 86 shows frustration at number 2, at number 2 thinking of himself as a private eye. So this leads to number 2 and number 86 having a back and forth argument about whether or not number 2 is a private eye. So the whole R2 are not argument. Afterwards, number 86 comments that she came into the janitor's closet because she's looking for paper towels for the girls' bathroom. And she does find them, but not before she beats up number 2 because he calls her Toots. After number 86 leaves the janitor's closet, number 2 hears number 86 screaming, so he rushes out to the hallway to see what she was screaming about. Number 2 finds a group of kids gathered around presumably number 86's location, but one of the hall monitors tells the kids to go back to their respective classes. Number 2's narration reveals this particular hall monitor's name is Joe Beluga, and the narration also reveals that number 2 was Joe's partner when number 2 was a member of the hall monitor force. Number 2 was part of the hall monitor group before he joined the kids next door. And number 2 also comments that Joe was, he describes Joe as being a bad cop and a worse friend. Number 2 goes to see Joe, and while Joe insists that he told the civilians to return to their respective classes, he eventually relents in letting number 2 stay when number 2 comments about keeping an eye on Joe for old time's sake, or he says something along those lines anyway. But Joe admits that it's not the most pleasant of sights, and Joe shows number 2 that number 86 was hit by, number 86 now has pink eye, and Joe explains that there's someone who's going around filling their water balloons with, someone is filling water balloons with the pink-eye virus, and they're using these slingshot guns to shoot people with the pink-eye virus-filled water balloons. When number 2 comments about how he knows number 86 and how she was in the janitor's closet, his office, just a little while ago, Joe seems to, number 2 figures that Joe is trying to Joe is suspecting him of being the one who hit number 86 with the pink-eye virus. But number two realizes what Joe is accusing him of, and he tells him that it isn't him. And soon enough, though, Nurse Claiborne arrives to bring number 86 back to her office to treat the pink eye. She also notices number 2 around, and at first, Nurse Claiborne thinks that number 2 is part of the hall monitor group again. But after number 2 clarifies that he's doing some private eye work, Nurse Claiborne warns number 2 that he better be careful or else he might get caught with pink eye as well. After Nurse Claiborne leaves, Joe comments about how he's taken all the hall passes so that he's the only one who's actually allowed in the hallways. And he also says that he considers number 2 to be the prime suspect, despite number 2 saying otherwise. But number 2 doesn't seem to be bothered too much. It's actually Joe who seems to be the one that's more irritated. But number 2 decides to head back to the janitor's closet. He's thinking to himself about what's going on with the case, because that's right, Nurse Claiborne also commented that number 86 was the 13th person to be hit with the pink-eye virus. So number 2 is trying to figure out what the connection is before he eventually decides that it's not any of his business. But when he returns to the janitor's closet, he finds a mess. Yeah, he finds that the janitor's closet is in a messy appearance right now, and the apple crumbles are gone. Number 2 decides that now it's personal and now he's going to get involved. But he's trying to figure out what all of the victims of the pink-eye virus have in common. Suddenly, we see a shadowy figure, or rather we see the shadow of someone launching a water balloon at number 2. And the individual runs away before we, the audience, have a good look at their face. But we see that the individual didn't have the best of aim, because number 2's shoulder was hit with the water balloon. And number 2 comments that it was a close call. So he proceeds to chase after the individual. Number 2 seems to have an idea of who the individual is, and he actually manages to trick them, or he goes around so that he can corner the individual when the individual thinks that they lost number 2. The individual happens to be Joe Beluga himself, and number 2 has his own water balloon slingshot gun ready, and he pretty much comments about how he figured out that Joe was the one hitting kids with the pink-eye virus-filled water balloons, and he says that Joe is a disgrace to the hall monitor name. Joe goes on a rant about how this is much bigger than they would originally anticipate, and saying that he had no choice in the matter. But eventually he relents and says that he will tell number 2 who the true mastermind behind this is, the one who has arranged for Joe to hit the kids with pink-eye virus-filled water balloons. But before Joe has the chance to say the culprit's name, Joe is hit with a pink-eye virus-filled water balloon himself. Both his eyes are now covered with pink eye. He has pink eye in both eyes, and there's pink eye crust. Eye crust is covering not just his eyes, but parts of his face as well. It's leading to his mouth being muffled so he can't talk properly. Number 2 tries to hit the culprit with his own water balloon, but the culprit is hidden behind one of the hallways or one of the corners to another hallway, and escapes before number 2 can get a good look at the culprit's face. But number 2 decides that he'll take Joe to the nurse's office, thinking he can't just leave Joe in this predicament. So number 2 arrives at Nurse Claiborne's office, and Nurse Claiborne assures number 2 that she'll take care of Joe. And she actually encourages number 2 to try some apple crumbles while she tends to Joe's condition. Number 2, however, notices that number 86 and the other the other victims of the pink-eye virus are not present right now, and he inquires Nurse Claiborne about their location. Nurse Claiborne admits that they're in the back room, but she encourages number 2 not to enter the back room, saying that there's a chance that he might get infected with pink-eye as well. Number 2, however, says that he's not worried about, or he wouldn't worry about himself right now, and he's about to open the door. But Nurse Claiborne, in a rather desperate tone, urges number 2 to simply take the apple crumble plate and just leave or return to class. But number 2 says he will after he's looked into the room, and Nurse Claiborne lets out a big no as number 2 opens the door. And we find that the back room, or yes, the other pink-eye victims are in the back room, but they're under these, the counters that they're lying on, or there's these machines over, there's a giant machine over on the ceiling where they're lying down on, and there's these, this machinery is taking the eye crust from the pink-eye victims, and essentially, the eye crust is actually the topping of the apple crumbles, and number 2 is rather understandably grossed out to find out about what he's been eating this entire time. Nurse Claiborne seems to brush off how gross it is, commenting that her plan is brilliant and how she has been making so much money from bake sales, and she doesn't intend to stop this operation anytime soon. And now she comments that she'll dispose of number 2 now. She prepares a pink-eye virus-filled water balloon in her slingshot gun, and she's about to hit number 2 with it. But suddenly, someone hits... Joe actually managed to hit Nurse Claiborne with a pink-eye virus-filled water balloon. And so half of Nurse Claiborne's face is now covered in eye crust. Nurse Claiborne uses a pink-eye virus-filled water balloon on Joe, which actually traps Joe onto the wall. Joe is now trapped to the wall. Eye crust is sticking Joe to the wall now after Nurse Claiborne had hit him with a pink-eye virus-filled water balloon, and she's about to load another one to hit number 2, but Joe distracting Nurse Claiborne distracted her long enough so number 2 could contact the kids next door so they could put a stop to Nurse Claiborne's plans. Nurse Claiborne says that they'll never take her, and she launches the pink-eye virus-filled water balloon onto herself. Number 2 sees what looks like Nurse Claiborne covered in eye crust, but then suddenly the eye crust covered Nurse Claiborne crumbles apart. It turns out this was actually a distraction. Nurse Claiborne can be heard somewhere else within the room. She lets out an evil laugh, and we see her silhouette as she's running across a catwalk higher up in the room, and she tells number 2 that this isn't the last that they've seen of her. After Nurse Claiborne escapes, the other Sector V operatives enter the room, and number 2 provides an explanation with a scene of montage, with a montage showing us scenes that correlate with number 2's narration. Number 2 explains that the kids next door were able to cure the pink-eye victims of their pink eye, and he also reveals that it was eventually revealed that Joe Beluga really was helping Nurse Claiborne out. He was getting free apple crumbles for bringing Nurse Claiborne pink-eye victims. Joe says that he didn't know what exactly Nurse Claiborne was using the pink-eye victims for, and number 2 admits that he believes Joe because he considers Joe to be not the brightest bulb in the drawer, so to speak. And he also, number 2 also comments that number 41 and number 43 were assigned to track down Nurse Claiborne. So eventually, number 2 returns to the janitor's closet, and we reach the scene that started out the segment, number 2 holding the plate of apple crumbles and preparing to throw them out. However, number 2 actually changes his mind and he decides to still eat the apple crumbles anyway. And the other Sector V operatives and number 86 are now in the janitor's closet with number 2. And number 3 number 3 inquires what's the filling of the apple crumbles, since they know that the eye crust was the topping. And then the segment ends with number 86 sneezing and some mucus covering her hands, giving us an implied answer for what's the filling of the apple crumble. So this segment is not only a number 2 spotlight appearance, but it also starts another set of segments or entries. Yes, this starts another tradition of entries, or a series of entries that relate to each other because of a theme. In this case, film noir. Now, more often than not, number 2 is usually the spotlight character in these film noir styled entries in the series. However, there is one segment in season 6 where a different Sector V operative actually gets to be the spotlight character for a film noir styled entry. So we'll cross that bridge eventually. It won't be for a while, but we'll eventually cover that particular segment. But yes, there's going to be more film noir styled entries in the series, and honestly, I actually really like these film noir entries, or styled entries. I always did like film noir, so having entries that are styled after them was pretty cool if you wanted my 2 cents on the matter. Otherwise, this segment also introduced us to 2 other characters, Joe Beluga, who was a former partner for number 2 on the hall monitor group, and Nurse Claiborne, who ended up being a villain. And yes, with Nurse Claiborne and the truth about her apple crumbles, Nurse Claiborne's plan is considered probably the most prevalent example of nausea fuel within the series. Yes, some fans go as far as to say that Nurse Claiborne beats the common cold when it comes to a villain in the show that has a bit of nausea fuel surrounding their plans, and I can definitely understand why many fans would feel that way. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to touch those apple crumbles, and I'm honestly surprised that number 2 is still eating them, even though he knows what they're, some of the ingredients. Even though he knows some of the ingredients for these apple crumbles, he's still eating them, and I don't know how he's able to stomach it, to say the least. So otherwise, that's right. Although Nurse Claiborne escaped at the end of the segment, and she said that this wasn't the last we'd see of her. And yes, I might as well say it now. She's right. This isn't the last we've seen of her. She does make a return later on in the series, but we'll cross that bridge eventually. Now, as for Joe, Joe Beluga does return in later entries as well. Or at least I do remember one more entry he appears in. Maybe he has a few other ones. I'll have my memory refreshed as I rewatch the later entries. But yes, I do remember at least one more entry that Joe plays an important role in, or he does appear at least. And Joe kind of does represent a crooked cop, although more like a crooked hall monitor in his case. But he did still ended up pulling through in the end when he distracted Nurse Claiborne long enough for number 2 to contact the kids next door. And we do see that with his other appearance that I'm thinking of. Joe can come off as somewhat of a jerk, but he still shows that he can have moments of being reasonable. So we'll see more of that in his other appearance as well. Otherwise, yes, we see number 86 attends Gallagher Elementary School like the Sector V operatives, and I was mistaken. I thought that her last name, Fulbright, was said out loud in this segment, but it actually isn't said out loud in this segment, so I was mistaken there. I guess we'll have to see if any later entries mention number 86's last name out loud, or have my memory refreshed as I rewatch later entries. But yes, I thought I might as well just bring that up for anyone who was curious. So otherwise, yeah, there isn't really too much else to talk about for this segment, but it starts the tradition of film noir styled entries in the series. Number 2 gets another spotlight appearance, which actually tells us some of his backstory, with him being part of the hall monitor group before he joined the Kids Next Door, and we get to meet his former partner with the hall monitors, and we're also introduced to Nurse Claiborne, a villain who some fans argue rivaled the common cold in terms of nausea fuel. And yes, we will see Nurse Claiborne again in a later entry in the series. But for now, I believe that's it for this particular segment. So as of this video, we've now discussed the A segment of episode 33 of Codename Kids Next Door on this channel. Take care, and until next time.